Did you know that Max Verstappen is just 1 point away from being out of F1 due to a penalty? The most worrying thing wasn't losing pole in Canada, but that he now risks being suspended if he makes one more mistake. Comment now. Do you think Verstappen deserves a penalty, or is it just part of a show? But what's really going on inside Red Bull that puts all this at stake? In this video, we're going to analyze what the media didn't show you about Max Verstappen's qualifying in Canada 2025, and why everything could change very soon. The 2025 Canadian Grand Prix made one thing very clear from qualifying: nothing is certain this season. Max Verstappen, who had been dominating free practice, ended up finishing second in Q3, surpassed by an inspired George Russell, who took his first pole of the year. The gap was minimal, just 0.160 seconds separated the Briton from the Dutchman. But that gap tells a much more complex story. It wasn't simply that Russell was faster. It was a strategic, technical, and psychological battle, with risky decisions by the two teams under the most pressure at the moment, Red Bull and Mercedes. Both drivers chose medium tires for the final flying lap. This isn't a typical choice. On a circuit like Montreal, where temperatures were colder than normal, the logical thing would have been to use the softer compounds. But they didn't. They opted for the C5 compound, which requires more work to reach its optimal temperature. This wasn't a simple experiment. It was a statement of absolute confidence in the recent changes to their cars. In Red Bull's case, it was a gamble that showed how hard they're trying to make up ground. The RB21 has been criticized for its instability, especially on circuits like Canada, where curbs and surface changes can throw off the car's balance. Even so, Verstappen went with that tire choice, confident that recent improvements to the chassis and aerodynamics would be enough. Verstappen had dominated the first free practice session, setting a time that made it seem like no one would be able to match it. But what we saw in qualifying was something else. Mercedes came closer than expected. Red Bull couldn't hold on to the lead. And that wasn't a coincidence. It was the result of multiple factors colliding at the same time: tire strategies, car sensitivity, track conditions, and, above all, pressure. This result set off alarm bells in Milton Keynes. Because if Max can't get the most out of the RB21 on a track where it has traditionally been competitive, what will happen on the circuits to come, where the car has already shown more serious weaknesses? And this is where the real story begins to take shape. Red Bull continues to win races, yes, but its dominance is no longer absolute. The gap is closing. Mercedes appears when least expected. McLaren has been threatening from the start of the season. And Max, although he remains the strongest driver at the moment, can no longer trust the car to do the work for him. What we saw in qualifying in Canada was misleading. Yes, Max Verstappen finished second, and just a few tenths off pole. But what really matters is how he achieved that lap. And more importantly, what Red Bull had to do to get there. Beneath the surface, the RB21 is still plagued by the same issues that have plagued it since the start of the season. What the headlines don't tell you is that this car is nowhere near the technical dominance Red Bull enjoyed in 2021 or 2024. The car is fast, yes, but it struggles. A lot. And it struggles especially at circuits like Montreal, where stability over curbs and uneven surfaces isn't optional, it's critical. Red Bull arrived in Canada knowing that the layout would expose its most uncomfortable weaknesses. The RB21 has a structural issue that makes it especially difficult to handle when dealing with slow, bumpy corners and elevation changes. This isn't a setup issue. It's a design flaw that stems from the very foundation of the chassis. And Verstappen has made it clear more than once. In practice sessions, what wasn't seen on screen is that Red Bull tried several aggressive changes to the car's setup, and the results were negative. So much so that they had to reverse the modifications and return to a previous specification. This regression shows an extreme level of sensitivity in the car. Any minimal adjustment profoundly affects overall stability. And that, in modern Formula One, is a red flag. Technical director Pierre Watch put it bluntly: to find a good setup on this car, you only need to move a millimeter, or you only need to move it and ruin everything. That's the performance window the RB21 operates in. Narrow, demanding, unpredictable. That's not how you race calmly. That's how you survive. Furthermore, there's a key variable that almost no one is considering. Adrian Newey, the technical genius behind the champion Red Bulls, is no longer directly involved with the development of this car. And he warned before leaving. Ground effect cars like the RB21, without skirts to seal the airflow underneath, are vulnerable to aerodynamic losses, especially when the car drops too low. And that's exactly what happened in Montreal. The car loses weight in areas where it should be more stable. It shakes, it bounces, it loses grip, and worst of all, it does so without warning. Verstappen has learned to compensate with his talent, but that doesn't eliminate the problem. It only masks it. That's why it's so important to understand that second place in Canada wasn't a sign of full recovery. It was a perfect lap by Max, amid an imperfect environment. Red Bull didn't solve his problems. It only managed to hide them for a moment. And that brings us to the real question. If this is the RB21's limit, how much further can Verstappen push before everything collapses? What many overlooked after qualifying in Canada has nothing to do with the stopwatch. The real risk for Max Verstappen isn't in the car, or even in his rivals. It's in the regulations. And it's closer than it seems. Max Verstappen arrived at the Canadian Grand Prix with 11 penalty points on his super license. That number isn't coincidental, nor is it insignificant. In Formula One, if a driver reaches 12 points in a 12-month period, they receive an automatic one-race ban with no possibility of appeal. Yes, Max is literally just 1 point away from being ruled out of a race. And that point can come from any on-track incident, a minor collision, a risky maneuver, or even a track limits violation. This situation isn't new for the FIA, but it is for someone like Verstappen, who has been the dominant face of the sport in recent years. His aggressive, direct style has won him championships, but now he's under a stricter scrutiny than ever. Every move he makes is being evaluated in more detail. Every defense or attack is reviewed with an expectation of almost surgical correction. And most critically, the next Grand Prix after Canada is Austria, the Red Bull Ring, the team's home race, and also the event where thousands of Dutch fans travel just to see Max. Missing that race due to a penalty would be a brutal blow, not only sportingly, but emotionally, symbolically, and commercially. The pressure isn't just on him. Red Bull knows this. The team has to balance its need for results with the urgency of keeping its star driver away from the disciplinary limit. And that completely changes the race strategy. It's no longer enough to simply attack. Now, every decision Verstappen makes on track has to go through a mental filter. Is it worth risking this for one more position? Or one more point? That's a question that didn't used to exist for him. Now it does. All of this became even more delicate after the incident with George Russell in Spain. There, Max received 3 penalty points after a collision that many considered questionable. But the relevant point wasn't whether the penalty was fair or not. The relevant point was that those 3 points put him on the brink. It was a change of narrative in his season. Suddenly, any minor mistake could mean missing a key round. And we mustn't forget what Russell himself said. He was clear in his position. If Verstappen gets another point and misses a race, it wouldn't be unfair. The points are there. That statement isn't just an opinion. It's a warning. And it's also a message to the stewards. They're watching. Max's every move will be scrutinized more closely than ever. Not only by his rivals, but by those making decisions in the control tower. On a circuit like Montreal, that pressure is even more intense. It's a track where mistakes abound. The famous Wall of Champions has claimed victims for years. Tight corners, late braking, surface changes, everything conspires to make even the best drivers make a small mistake. And for Max, that mistake wouldn't result in an off-track exit. It would result in her exclusion from the following weekend. The dilemma is clear. Verstappen has to keep racing at the limit because that's his essence. But at the same time, he has to avoid any situation that the stewards could turn into a penalty. And that, psychologically, is one of the toughest tests a competitive driver can face. It's a silent threat. It's not visible on the timesheets. It's not noticeable in the technical analysis. But it's there. It determines everything that happens on the track. And while Red Bull tries to fix the car's problems, Max has to fix something even more difficult: his risk margin. Amid the RB21's technical issues and the pressure on Verstappen, Red Bull rolled out a series of key improvements in Montreal. And while at first glance they seem to work, the reality is much more nuanced. It wasn't a revolution, but a measured evolution. And that changes everything. The updates introduced weren't superficial. Red Bull brought a new aerodynamic package, which included floor modifications, tweaks to the diffuser, and a new interaction with the front wing that had already been debuted in Spain. These improvements had two clear objectives: generating more downforce and reducing instability in slow corners, precisely where the RB21 suffers most. Paul Monahan, one of the team's chief engineers, explained it clearly. These updates weren't miraculous, but they did represent an incremental step. A measured advance that sought to recover some of the lost performance without compromising the car's overall balance. We're talking about details like the shape of the Venturi channels, changes to the sidewalls, and subtle variations in the side pods. Small modifications, yes, but in Formula One, a small change in the right direction can make the difference between winning and missing out on the podium. The problem is that these improvements don't address the core of the problem. Red Bull knows the RB21 has an unstable foundation, and these modifications were designed more to make the car predictable than dominant. It's not about gaining tenths per lap, but rather reducing the risk of driver errors. In other words, they're working more on giving Verstappen confidence than on extending the technical advantage they used to have. There's a crucial difference between a fast car and one that's easy to drive. And that's exactly Red Bull's dilemma right now. They can improve consistency, but they haven't managed to regain absolute authority over the rest of the field. And meanwhile, McLaren and Mercedes aren't waiting. Furthermore, there's one detail that almost went unnoticed. Although these improvements were implemented in Canada, the real objective is to evaluate their effectiveness ahead of the Spanish Grand Prix, where Red Bull hopes to have a clearer reading of performance under more stable conditions. In other words, Montreal was a covert testing ground, an opportunity to verify what works and what doesn't in the midst of real competition. This also explains why Verstappen's performance was so variable over the weekend. The car behaved one way in FP1, completely differently in FP2, and he changed it again in qualifying. Not because they made a mistake, but because they were searching for the exact limit of this new aerodynamic package. Even Helmut Marko acknowledged that the changes didn't have as much of a long-term impact as they had hoped. They worked for a fast lap, yes, but in race conditions, the car was still difficult to handle. That comment says it all. Red Bull is no longer competing from a position of absolute advantage. Now they have to be surgical in every decision, because any technical error amplifies all the car's problems. And most revealing of all is that, according to sources within the team, these improvements weren't fully implemented for his teammate, Yuki Tsunoda, either. The Japanese driver continues to have serious problems adapting to the RB21, confirming that the car remains highly demanding and not suitable for all driving styles. A dominant car should be able to adapt to different drivers. This raises a big question. To what extent can Verstappen continue to compensate with talent for what the car lacks in aerodynamics? And whether his rivals continue to progress? While Red Bull tries to maintain control of a season it no longer dominates, two teams are taking advantage of every opportunity to quietly inch closer to power. One is doing so through technical reconstruction, the other through aggressive ambition. Both have begun to change the landscape of Formula One in 2025. We're talking, of course, about Mercedes and McLaren. The big surprise in Canada wasn't that Max Verstappen didn't take pole. It was that George Russell did. Because until now, Mercedes hadn't shown clear signs of being ready to fight for the top spot. They'd been close, yes. They'd improved, too. But in Montreal, they took a step further. Not only did they manage to get onto the front row, they also made it clear that their car has begun to respond under pressure. The result was a much more balanced car with a solid foundation for fast laps. And the most interesting thing is that this evolution didn't happen in a vacuum. It was accompanied by a solid understanding of the track conditions. Mercedes understood that Montreal required aerodynamic efficiency without sacrificing traction, and they executed that balance better than Red Bull, even better than McLaren. On the other hand, McLaren had an atypical weekend. Accustomed to leading with authority, they arrived in Montreal to find the worst Friday of the year. Lando Norris was the first to admit it. He said the car was difficult to set up and that, despite the new aerodynamic parts, they couldn't find the ideal balance. And that's surprising, because McLaren arrived in Canada with one of the most ambitious development packages of the year. They introduced a new front wing with revised geometry, known for its siren tails, modifications to the front suspension, and also an updated rear wing. All of these elements were designed to improve aerodynamic performance and optimize flow in varied conditions. But Montreal didn't let them down. Practice was marked by visible tests, aerodynamic rakes, flow-vis paint, direct comparisons between new and old versions of components. This shows that McLaren used Friday more as a data laboratory than a traditional preparation session. And that has advantages, but also risks. What's interesting is how the forces are aligning. Red Bull is defending more than attacking. Mercedes is making a strong comeback from behind. And McLaren, although still the most complete rival, showed cracks in its technical structure for the first time. This dynamic turns every Grand Prix into a tactical battle, not just a matter of speed. And while this is happening, Verstappen remains at the center of the storm. His team is on the ropes, rivals are closing in, and he has to balance talent, strategy, and personal discipline if he wants to remain the leader of the grid. What happened in Canada wasn't just a close qualifying session. It was a silent warning that things are changing. Verstappen no longer competes with the same ease as before. Red Bull no longer has an unbeatable car. And rivals are stopping chasing and starting to challenge. That's the new reality. In short, the RB21 is still fast, but unpredictable. Improvements only work in parts. Max's qualifying session was impressive, not because the car was perfect, but because he managed to control it to its limit. And that, while admirable, is also alarming. Because no driver can sustain an entire season on a knife's edge without consequences. Furthermore, the risk of a penalty weighs more than ever. Verstappen is just 1 point away from missing a race. And that slim margin will influence every decision he makes on track. The aggression that took him to the top may now be his biggest threat. And that changes the entire narrative of the season. Red Bull, for its part, is fighting on two fronts. On the one hand, it's trying to contain the technical problems of a car that no longer performs as it used to. On the other, it must manage internal pressure, external expectations, and the growing tension between preserving its star and not losing control of the situation. It's a battle as technical as it is political. And while all this is happening, Mercedes and McLaren are moving forward. One from order and recovery, the other from constant evolution. Both are building a real threat. It's no longer just about individual races. It's about control of the championship. And right now it's at stake. So yes, what looked like a simple second place on the Montreal timesheets is much more than that. It's a reflection of a championship that is breaking apart in several directions at the same time. And Verstappen, although still the center of attention, is surrounded by uncertainty like never before. The truth is that everything that happens in the coming weeks will make a difference. The margins are minimal. Decisions matter more than ever. And mistakes, no matter how small, can be very costly. Let me know in the comments what you think. Can Max Verstappen withstand this level of pressure? How much longer can Red Bull stay in the fight with partial adjustments and temporary solutions?